Winl, a botanical illustrator from Ann Arbor, arrived there for what she called her creative retreat. She wanted 5 days of peace, sketching and solitude, no emails, no calls, just her art and the winter silence. Her cabin sat a quarter-mile off County Road 706, hidden behind white pines and birch trees, accessible only by a narrow gravel drive. It belonged to a retired orthopedic surgeon, Adrienne Winl, who still rented it the old-fashioned way, through a handwritten note tacked up at the Honor General Store. No website, no deposit, just cash, a handshake, and a signed waiver acknowledging the lack of internet, plumbing beyond a well pump, and the nearest emergency services 20 minutes away, on a good day. Adrienne arrived on a Tuesday afternoon under a pale gray sky. Her last confirmed sighting was at Bula Fuel and Feed, a small gas station and bait shop about 3 miles south of the cabin. Security footage captured her buying firewood, kerosene, apples, and a paperback mystery novel. She wore a gray wool peacoat and a knit cap embroidered with a tiny red cardinal. Before leaving, she smiled and waved at the cashier, Darlene Kopp, who would later describe her as calm and cheerful, someone looking forward to the quiet. That short clip, time-stamped 3:47 p.m. on November 17th, would later become the most scrutinized piece of evidence in her disappearance. Adrienne Winl expected Adrienne to return the cabin key by Sunday morning. When she didn't, he assumed the weather had delayed her. Snow had fallen heavily since Thursday, and the drive was often impassable. By Monday, concern replaced patience. He parked his pickup at the base of the road and hiked through knee-deep snow to the cabin. The door was locked from the inside. He called her name. No answer. Using his spare key, he stepped into silence. The cabin was cold but undisturbed. A half-finished charcoal sketch of a winterberry branch lay on the table, her open suitcase on the bed, a mug of tea long gone cold beside the stove, her boots by the door, her coat still hanging on its peg. Adrienne herself had vanished. Outside, fresh snow had smoothed every surface, swallowing all signs of movement. No tire tracks, no footprints. Only untouched white stillness pressing against the windows. Vest drove straight to the Benzie County Sheriff's Office. Within hours, deputies, state troopers, and volunteers from the Honor Fire Department began an intensive search. Helicopters scanned the frozen riverbanks while divers cut through the ice on Platte Lake. For 9 relentless days, they found nothing. Not a glove, not a scarf, not a single indication she'd ever left that cabin. Adrienne's sister, Claire Winl, flew in from Philadelphia and faced reporters at the county courthouse. Standing beside a photo of Adrienne smiling in a summer garden, Claire's voice trembled as she described her sister's warmth, how she remembered every birthday, every flower she'd ever drawn. Their parents, both retired teachers from Kalamazoo, offered a $15,000 reward. Leads trickled in. A hunter's vague sighting near Highway M22, a psychic's coordinates to an abandoned deer blind, but none held. By December, the search was officially suspended. The cabin padlocked once more, and Adrienne's name entered into Michigan's missing persons database, where it would remain for nearly 10 years. Then, in February of 2019, 2 brothers, Lucas and Jeremy Toth, were snowmobiling across state forest land near the northern edge of Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore when they noticed something jutting from the ice. It was a weathered canvas messenger bag, half buried and frozen stiff. Inside were waterlogged pages of a sketchbook, a rusted tin of charcoal pencils, and a laminated library card with one name still legible: Adrienne Winl. The Toth brothers, lifelong residents of Empire, Michigan, recognized the name immediately. Their mother had joined the original search back in 2009. They recorded the GPS coordinates and rode straight to the Philip A. Hart Visitor Center Ranger Station. Within 12 hours, the Benzie County Sheriff's Office reopened the case. Detective Warren Coolidge, now a seasoned investigator but once a rookie on the original search, was assigned lead. He remembered the case well, not just for its mystery, but for its eerie wrongness. No struggle, no signs of departure, yet no body. Just a life paused mid-motion, as if winter itself had swallowed her whole. This time, Coolidge ordered the messenger bag to be processed under the strictest forensic protocols available, determined to find the truth buried beneath a decade of ice and silence. Several pages in the sketchbook were so badly water-damaged that they were beyond recovery, but 3 pages from near the center remained surprisingly legible. One of those drawings depicted precisely the same winterberry branch that lay unfinished on the table in the cabin. A striking match between what she left behind and what she carried with her. A second page bore the handwritten date November 19th, 2 days after her arrival, and in the margin, a note scrawled in her own hand. Someone knocked last night, didn't answer, stood outside for a long time. The third page, its edge torn and creased, contained only 5 chilling words. He knows I'm alone. Here. The discovery of the messenger bag didn't merely reopen a case file, it cracked open a wound that had long lain raw in the tight-knit woods surrounding the sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore. For the families who walked those snowy grids in 2009, for the volunteers whose boots wore through trails in the cold, the bag became something more than evidence. It became proof that she had been out there somewhere, beyond the perimeter they'd defined, beyond the assumptions about how far someone should walk in a snowstorm without a coat or a farewell. On a gray February morning in the evidence room of the Benzie County Sheriff's Office, Detective Warren Coolidge laid the messenger bag, frozen leather strap, soaked sketchbook pages, on a steel table under harsh fluorescent light. Beside him, 3 stacked cardboard boxes held the forgotten archives, interview transcripts, search maps, weather reports, and crisp photographs of the cabin interior taken the day the rental owner reported her missing. He opened the first box and began reading. The initial response to her disappearance had been swift and methodical. Within 6 hours of the call, a command center had been established at the township hall. Search and rescue teams from 4 counties mobilized. The Michigan State Police deployed its aviation unit. Cadaver dogs came from as far as Grand Rapids. But from the start, the operation was hampered by weather and terrain. A blizzard swept through on November 23rd, dumping 8 inches of snow, visibility dropping to near zero, the temperature plunging to 14 degrees Fahrenheit and turning hypothermia into a real risk, not only for the missing woman, but for every searcher in the woods. By November 28th, over Thanksgiving weekend, the official search radius had stretched to nearly 6 square miles, covering dense forest, frozen wetlands, and sections of the Platte River where the current was swift enough to prevent ice from forming. Divers probed beneath the surface while horseback teams traced trails too narrow for ATVs. And still there was nothing. No footprint preserved by fallen branches, no scrap of fabric caught on barbed wire, no disturbance in the landscape to suggest she had passed through at all. The search coordinator at the time, a retired Marine named Gerald Foss, wrote in his final report that the sheer absence of evidence was statistically improbable given the extent and intensity of the efforts. He said that in his 18 years of coordinating wilderness rescues across northern Michigan, he had never encountered a missing person who left so little trace behind. He concluded with a statement that Coolidge now underlined twice. Either she had been removed from the area by vehicle, or she had never left the cabin on her own. Coolidge found the witness statement of Adrienne's sister, Claire Winl, filed in a manila folder near the bottom of that second box. Claire described her sister as methodical and cautious, someone who triple-checked door locks and always told people exactly where she would be and how long she'd be gone. She said Adrienne had arrived for the trip excited, not anxious, with no recent conflicts, no financial pressures, no romantic drama that might explain a sudden departure. Phone records confirmed that in the days before she left there were only routine calls, to botanical supply companies, to her sister. Her bank account showed no activity after November 17th. Her car, the year 2006 Honda CR-V, was still parked at the cabin, keys in the ignition, tank half full. But what caught Coolidge's attention now was a detail that had been dismissed as coincidence years earlier. On the morning of November 18th, Adrienne phoned her sister using the landline in the cabin. Cell service was non-existent, and told her the place was perfect, quiet, and beautiful. She then added something odd. She felt like someone had been near the cabin recently. When Claire pressed her, Adrienne said she'd found fresh cigarette butts near the woodpile and boot prints tracing a path from the tree line to the back window, then disappearing into the brush. She wasn't frightened, only puzzled. Claire asked if she reported it to the rental owner, but there was no record that she did. Coolidge made a note. He needed to interview the rental owner, the retired surgeon who rented the cabin, once again. The file showed he had been cooperative, provided access to rental records and a full guest list of the past 3 years, and had a solid alibi. He was in Traverse City attending a medical conference when Adrienne vanished, confirmed by hotel records and witnesses. Yet those cigarette butts and boot prints, once minor details, now felt like threads worth pulling. Within days, the forensic lab delivered its findings. The pages inside the messenger bag matched the exact paper stock of Adrienne's sketchbooks, those retrieved from her Ann Arbor apartment after she vanished. A handwriting expert compared those marginal notes to her journals and contracts and conclusively verified them as hers. But the bag itself told 2 stories. The leather strap bore clay-rich soil consistent with riverbank earth, not the sandy loam typical around the cabin near the Platte River in Michigan. And tucked in the lining were microscopic dark blue synthetic fibers, likely from a jacket or tarp, and under UV light 3 faint bloodstains showed up. DNA testing was ordered immediately. Meanwhile, Detective Warren Kulich assembled a new search team with a different plan. Instead of guessing where someone might wander, they would follow the physical evidence backward from where the bag was found, roughly 4 miles north-northeast of the cabin, in a forested section outside the original search perimeter. That terrain was thick with undergrowth and seasonal streams, far from the beaten path, a place entered only if you knew your way or someone guided you there. Kulich requested ground-penetrating radar, a cadaver dog unit, and reached out to Dr. Lillian Schott, a forensic anthropologist from Michigan State University, specializing in cold case recoveries in wilderness settings. Schott arrived in honor on March 11th with her graduate team, establishing a base camp half a mile from the bag site and modeling likely paths of travel and sediment shift based on 2009's weather data, knowing that heavy snow and spring flooding could move or bury small objects before discovery. On March 9th, the cadaver dog Rue, a German shepherd, alerted near a collapsed riverbank section about 60 yards west of the bag's location. The soil there was unstable, eroded by seasonal flooding, and frozen longer than surrounding areas thanks to a dense hemlock canopy. Schott's team excavated carefully, sifting through thin layers of dirt. On day 2, they uncovered a piece of gray wool that matched the coat Adrienne wore in the security footage. Then found a button stamped with a tiny cardinal, the same emblem as the knit cap she threw on at the gas station. By day 4, they uncovered human bone fragments, part of the radius and ulna, buried 18 inches beneath the surface. No animal scavenging marks. Dental records were requested, though everyone knew the identification was only a formality. Meanwhile, the DNA from the bag's bloodstains came back. A maternal line match to Adrienne's sister, Claire. The bones were hers. The recovery site was secured and photographed. They also found a broken wristwatch, its face cracked, hands frozen at 11:43, and, buried about 3 feet from the bone fragments, wrapped in a deteriorated plastic bag, a rusted folding knife of a style sold at many hardware stores and sporting goods shops across the Midwest. No usable fingerprints, but microscopic blood traces on the hinge matched Adrienne's DNA. Kulich stood on that cold March afternoon at the edge of the site, watching the crew work with brushes and trowels, each movement slow, reverent. He thought back to the search in 2009, the hundreds of volunteers walking those woods believing they were searching for someone lost. But now, he understood. Adrienne Winl hadn't simply wandered into the forest and succumbed to the cold. She had been brought there. Someone had known she was alone, had waited until no one was watching, and had nearly gotten away with it for 10 years. With that knife discovered, everything changed. Motive, method, possibility. Within 48 hours of the messenger bag's discovery, Detective Warren Kulich ordered photographs of the blade circulated to every sporting goods store, hardware supplier, and outdoor outfitter within a 100-mile radius of the small town of Honor, Michigan. The blade was identified as made by Timber Ridge, a mid-tier brand sold primarily through regional chains in the Midwest. Model: a 4-inch lockback folding knife with a rubber grip, manufactured between 2005 and 2011. That meant thousands of them could have been purchased across Michigan during that window, but it was a tangible starting point. Kulich knew from over 15 years in law enforcement that a case this cold rarely cracked from a single piece of evidence. Instead, they fracture slowly under pressure, applied to just the right stress points. Returning to the original case file, Kulich systematically re-interviewed everyone connected to Adrienne's final days, starting with Marlon Vest, the retired orthopedic surgeon, now aged 73 and living on the outskirts of Frankfurt with his second wife, Patrice, a former surgical nurse. Startled when Kulich arrived unannounced on a gray late March Thursday, the kind of day when the horizon blurs between sky and lake, Vest answered the door in a cardigan and reading glasses, surprised but cooperative. They sat in his sunroom overlooking a dormant garden as the detective walked him through November 2009 once again. Vest reiterated what he told investigators years ago. He had been attending a medical conference in Traverse City from November 16th through 23rd and had not seen Adrienne in person. Their only contact was a phone call to confirm the reservation and drop off the cash envelope under the doormat as agreed. He had not returned to the cabin until the morning he discovered her missing. When Kulich asked about the fresh cigarette butts and boot prints Adrienne mentioned to her sister, Vest frowned and said he had no idea who might have been on the property. He himself didn't smoke, and had never seen anyone near the cabin. Coolidge drilled further. Had anyone expressed interest in the cabin around that time? Had Vest mentioned to locals that a woman would be staying alone there? Vest hesitated, then said he may have casually mentioned the rental at the Honor General store, but couldn't remember who might have been present. Coolidge made a note. The store was a communal hub where locals gathered for coffee and gossip, especially once tourist season thinned. One final question. Did Vest own a Timber Ridge lockback knife? Vest answered no, preferring fixed-blade hunting knives, and even retrieved one from his kitchen drawer to show. A completely different style, an heirloom from his father. Coolidge thanked him and left, but something nagged at him. Not necessarily suspicion of Vest, but the realization that Adrienne's stay at the cabin may not have been as private as she believed. In small towns, information travels fast and distances are short. The next person on Coolidge's list was Darlene Kopp, the cashier at Bula Fuel and Feed, who had rung up Adrienne's purchases. Coolidge found her behind the counter on her usual shift. She remembered Adrienne immediately. She said she thought about that young woman every winter when the first snow fell. She described Adrienne as polite, soft-spoken, content to be alone but not lonely. Coolidge asked if anyone else had been in the store during that afternoon. Anyone who might have noticed Adrienne or overheard where she was staying. Darlene thought a moment and listed a few regulars. Old Mr. Foster buying pipe tobacco, a couple of ice fishermen grabbing bait, and one Travis Lorne, who had been standing near the firewood display stacking logs for sale. Coolidge wrote the name down. Darlene continued. Travis worked odd jobs around the area, maintenance, landscaping, snow removal in winter. Quiet and kept to himself, but reliable. She thought he still lived somewhere near Platte Lake, though she hadn't seen him in the store recently. Coolidge asked if Travis smoked. Darlene responded, "Yes, roll your owns, the cheap kind." Coolidge returned to his office and ran a background check on Travis Allen Lorne, age 46, born and raised in Benzie County. No major criminal record, just a few minor infractions. A drunken disorderly charge in 2003, dismissed. A citation for trespassing on state land in 2007, paid fine. And a suspended driver's license in 2012 for unpaid child support, later reinstated. Lorne's last known address was a rental property on the south shore of Platte Lake, less than 2 miles from the cabin where Adrienne had stayed. Coolidge felt his pulse quicken. He pulled satellite images of the area from 2009 and cross-referenced them with the original search perimeter maps. Lorne's residence lay just outside the boundary of the first search, close enough to walk to the cabin through the woods in under 30 minutes. He called the property management company listed on the rental records and learned Lorne had lived there from 2008 until 2014, when he stopped paying rent and vanished without notice. Within 2 days of interviewing the landlord, Detective Warren Coolidge had a clearer picture of the man now sitting at the center of the investigation. The landlord described Travis Lorne as a difficult tenant, always late with rent, sometimes throwing rowdy gatherings despite a strict no-parties clause. When asked if Lorne owned any vehicles, the landlord recalled an old rust-colored Ford pickup and a snowmobile kept under a tarp behind the house. Following that lead, Coolidge ran a deeper search through county and court databases. He discovered that Lorne had filed for bankruptcy in 2015. The documents listed his meager assets: tools, a generator, camping gear, and several knives, none of which were identified by brand. But what caught the detective's attention was the forwarding address, a boarding house on 11th Street in Traverse City. The next morning, Coolidge drove north. The house was a faded Victorian with peeling paint and a sagging chain-link fence. The manager, Shelley Urbanski, said Lorne had rented a small upstairs room from 2015 to 2017, but left abruptly after an argument with another tenant. She didn't know where he went, but recalled that he mentioned working at a marina in Sutton's Bay, doing boat maintenance and dock repairs. Coolidge thanked her and made the 20-minute drive along the shoreline. The marina manager confirmed Lorne had worked there seasonally for 2 years, but hadn't shown up for the 2019 season, and wouldn't be rehired. Unreliable, the man said. Good with his hands, but you couldn't count on him. When asked where Lorne might be now, one of the dock hands spoke up. He thought Travis was living out of a camper deep in the state forest, moving around to avoid campground fees, a drifter who knew every back road and clearing where rangers didn't patrol. Back in Honor, Coolidge convened a strategy meeting with the Benzie County Sheriff, the Michigan State Police detective assigned to assist, and Dr. Lillian Schott, who had remained in the area to consult. He laid out what they knew. Travis Lorne had been present in the store where Adrienne Winl was last seen. He lived within walking distance of her rented cabin. He smoked hand-rolled cigarettes. He knew those woods like a map he'd drawn himself. Financially unstable, socially isolated and invisible to most of the community. He fit the quiet, low-profile archetype of someone who could commit a crime and vanish in plain sight. Dr. Schott pointed out that the recovery site where Adrienne's remains were found wasn't random. It was carefully chosen by someone who understood the forest's seasonal rhythms, flooding, and erosion. The sheriff authorized a warrant to search any property tied to Lorne and to bring him in for questioning. The challenge was finding him first. Coolidge coordinated with the Department of Natural Resources and pulled records of recent hunting and fishing licenses. Lorne had purchased a small game license in October 2018, listing a P.O. box in Interlochen. The detective drove there only to learn that the box had been closed 6 months earlier for non-payment, though the postal clerk remembered him clearly. Thin, weathered, always wearing a blue canvas jacket and a camouflage cap, paying in cash, rarely speaking or making eye contact. Then, on April 10th, a DNR officer patrolling near the Betsy River spotted a rusted camper matching that description parked illegally in a clearing off a remote fire road. Coolidge mobilized a team and reached the site just before dawn. The camper was an aging Winnebago from the late 1980s, tilted on uneven ground and surrounded by tarps, firewood, and plastic storage bins. Smoke curled from a makeshift fire pit. Coolidge approached with 2 deputies and knocked on the metal door. No response. He knocked again, identified himself. After a long silence, the latch clicked. Travis Lorne appeared barefoot and unshaven, wearing thermal underwear beneath the same blue canvas jacket the clerk had described. His eyes were hollow but calm. "We need to talk about November 2009, Coolidge said. Lorne stared for a beat, then nodded slowly. "I've been waiting for this conversation for a long time," he replied. Hours later, inside the Benzie County Sheriff's Office, Travis Lorne sat across from the detective in the interview room, silent for nearly 3 hours, before uttering more than 10 words. He had waived his right to an attorney, a choice that made Coolidge both cautious and hopeful. In his experience, suspects who did that were either innocent and eager to clear their name or guilty and convinced they could outthink the investigation. Lorne seemed to fit neither mold. He sat with folded hands, staring at the grain of the wooden table, occasionally glancing toward the two-way mirror, as if he could see through it. Coolidge began gently, asking where he'd been on the evening of November 19th, 2009. Lorne said he couldn't recall exact dates, but had been living near Platte Lake at the time, doing odd jobs, mostly snow removal for local businesses and elderly residents around Honor and Beulah. When Coolidge asked if he remembered a woman named Adrienne Winl, Lorne's jaw tightened. He said yes, not personally, but from the news and the search that had consumed the town. Everyone knew about the woman who vanished. Coolidge slid a photograph across the table, the grainy security camera still from Beulah Fuel and Feed showing Adrienne at the counter, with Lorne faintly visible in the background near the firewood display. Lorne's eyes flicked to it, then he nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That's me. I was stacking wood for Darlene. She paid me $20 when shipments came in." Lorne said he didn't remember interacting with Adrienne, or even noticing her that day. Detective Warren Coolidge leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "You were standing 6 feet from her for at least 4 minutes. You're saying you didn't see her, didn't hear her voice, didn't even notice where she was going?" Lorne's face stayed blank. He said the store was always busy, people in and out, and that he was focused on stacking the wood just the way Darlene wanted. Neat, level, precise. Coolidge shifted tactics. He brought up the cigarette butts found near the cabin. "Lorne smoked roll-your-owns. Did he ever walk that stretch of woods?" Lorne hesitated, then admitted he might have. "Sometimes he wandered through the forest at night when he couldn't sleep, following old logging trails and deer paths. It was possible, he said, that he'd passed near the cabin, but he didn't recall seeing anyone there." Coolidge pressed harder. "So you were in the area. You knew the woods. You saw her at the store the day she arrived. And now we've found her. Remains less than 2 miles from where you were. Living, along with a knife that matches a brand sold at every hardware store you likely shopped at." Lorne's fingers tightened into fists, then slowly released. He looked up for the first time. "I didn't kill her," he said. The words hung heavy in the stale air. Coolidge didn't look away. "Then what did you do?" he asked quietly. Lorne closed his eyes, and when he spoke again, his tone was softer, almost resigned. He said he'd seen Adrienne twice at the cabin. The first time was the night she arrived. He had been walking through the woods near dusk and noticed lights glowing in a cabin that was usually dark that time of year. Curiosity stopped him at the tree line. He saw her through the window unpacking, moving around the small kitchen. He didn't approach, just watched for a few minutes before continuing on. The second time was the following night. He returned to the same area, out of habit, he said. drawn by the silence along the river and the way the snow swallowed sound. He saw her again, this time standing on the porch smoking a cigarette. "I was surprised," he said. "She didn't look like a smoker." He stayed in the shadows, watching. After a few minutes, she went inside and locked the door. He heard the bolt slide. He lingered a while longer, maybe 20 minutes, then walked home. Coolidge felt a chill run through him. "You're admitting you stalked her," he said flatly. Lauren shook his head. "I wasn't stalking. I was just there. There's a difference." When asked why he never came forward during the search, Lauren said he'd been scared. "You know how it would look," he said. "A broke guy with no steady job, a couple of minor charges on record, admitting he was near the cabin where a woman vanished. I thought about turning myself in, more than once. But the longer I waited, the harder it got. When the search ended, I figured it didn't matter anymore. She was gone. Nothing I said would bring her back." Coolidge asked if he'd ever owned a Timber Ridge lockback knife. Lauren nodded slightly. He had bought one years earlier, around 2007 or 8, at a hardware store in Traverse City. Used it for fishing and cutting rope. Said he'd lost it somewhere in the woods around 2010 or 11. Couldn't remember where or when exactly. The interview stretched for another hour, circling the same points from different angles. Lauren's story never shifted, but never deepened. He admitted to being near the cabin, to watching Adrienne, to owning a knife like the one found with her remains. But he denied ever speaking to her, touching her, or harming her. The evidence was thin, circumstantial at best. His presence near the scene, his knife, his behavior. But no DNA tied him to the crime. No witnesses placed him at the cabin that night, and the knife handle held no fingerprints. The prosecutor told Coolidge they needed more before pressing charges. So, reluctantly, the detective returned to the room and told Lauren he was free to go, for now, but not to leave the area. Lauren stood, shoulders sagging, but paused at the door. "There's something I didn't tell you," he said. "I didn't think it mattered." He looked at the floor. "That second night, when I saw her on the porch, I wasn't alone out there." Coolidge froze. "What do you mean?" "I heard someone else," Lauren said. "Out east of me in the woods. Footsteps. Slow. Careful. Not an animal." He said he'd assumed it was another hiker or hunter, so he kept quiet and left. But after Adrienne vanished, he couldn't stop thinking that maybe whoever that was stayed behind after he walked away. "Did you see who it was?" Coolidge asked. Lauren shook his head. "Too dark. Too far. But they had a light, just a flicker of it, like a flashlight or headlamp. Then it went out." Coolidge's pulse quickened. "Why didn't you mention this 10 years ago?" he demanded. Lauren's voice dropped. "Because," he said, "back then, I wasn't sure if what I heard was real, or if I just didn't want to admit someone else was out there watching her too." Lauren had said he kept quiet for the same reason he kept quiet about everything else. Fear, self-preservation, or plain stupidity. "Pick one," he muttered before walking out of the sheriff's office, leaving Detective Warren Coolidge alone in the hallway with a mind spinning faster than the snow whipping outside. If Lauren was telling the truth, and that was still a monumental if, then someone else had been near Adrienne Winl's cabin the night she vanished. Someone carrying a light, someone who knew those woods well enough to move silently through them in the dark. Back at his office, Coolidge spread the original search records across his desk and began cross-referencing every deputy, volunteer, and property owner within a 5-mile radius of the cabin. Then he opened a separate file he'd been quietly building for the last 2 weeks. A background dossier on everyone with regular access to the forest, licensed hunters, local guides, and maintenance workers for the state park. One name kept surfacing again and again. Carl Hustis, a forest ranger with the Michigan Department of Natural Resources since 1998, assigned to the Platte River State Forest District, the same sector where Adrienne's remains had been found. Hustis had logged more volunteer hours in the 2009 search than nearly anyone else. He knew every trail, every seasonal creek, every clearing hidden beneath the canopy. But something about his personnel record made Coolidge pause. According to DNR files, Ranger Hustis had taken a 2-week personal leave starting November 20th, 2009, just 3 days after Adrienne arrived at the cabin. The reason given was family emergency, with no details attached. Coolidge called the DNR headquarters in Lansing. A clerk told him Hustis had retired in 2017 after nearly 20 years of service. His last known address was in Benzonia, a small village 12 miles south of Honor. Coolidge thanked the clerk, hung up, and sat staring at the forest map pinned to his wall, the red marker circling the cabin like a wound. Then he grabbed his jacket and keys. It was time to talk to the man who knew these woods better than anyone. Karl Hustis lived in a modest bungalow on the edge of Benzonia, surrounded by birch trees and a sagging split-rail fence. Kulich arrived just before sunset, the sky streaked in orange and violet. Hustis opened the door wearing flannel and slippers, a mug of coffee in hand. In his early 60s, he was broad-shouldered, bearded, with the wind-carved look of a man shaped by decades outdoors. He recognized Kulich immediately and invited him in without hesitation. Inside, the small living room was crowded with field guides, topographic maps, and framed photos of Michigan forests through the seasons. Kulich explained he was reviewing the Adrienne Winl case and needed to clarify a few old details. Hustis nodded. He remembered it well. "Hardest search I've ever been part of," he said. "Still bothers me we never found her." Kulich asked about the personal leave he'd taken in November 2009. Hustis frowned, thinking. His mother had fallen ill with pneumonia, he said, and he'd driven to Ohio to help his sister care for her. She recovered, but it had been a rough week. Kulich made a note. "Were you in the area before you left for Ohio?" he asked. Hustis nodded. He'd helped cover the southern quadrant of the search grid on November 22nd, the day after Adrienne was reported missing. "Before that?" Kulich pressed. A brief pause. Then Hustis said he patrolled the area regularly as part of his duties, checking vacant properties for trespassers or vandalism. He was familiar with the cabin, yes. Kulich then asked if he owned a Timber Ridge lockback knife. Hustis stood, walked to the kitchen, and returned with one in hand, identical to the knife found at the recovery site. "Standard ranger issue," he said. "Good for rope, brush, even field dressing." He'd owned it for over a decade. Kulich felt his stomach drop. "Ever lose one?" he asked carefully. Hustis shook his head. "I'm careful with my gear," he said, then added almost casually, "though I did lend this one out once, during the search. A volunteer needed it for cutting rope. Never got it back." 3 days later, Kulich found the name buried in a volunteer sign-in sheet from November 24th, 2009. The handwriting was rushed, barely legible, but it matched the description Hustis had given. Owen Barrage, age 34, address listed in honor, no phone number. Cross-checking county records, Kulich found only a thin file. Barrage had lived in town from 2007 to 2011, renting a small house near the old railroad tracks. His employment history was scattered. Dishwasher in Frankfurt, stock clerk at a hardware store in Beulah, seasonal labor at a Christmas tree farm near Empire. No criminal record, no vehicle registration, no property ownership. And just like that, a new name. Quiet, ordinary, easily overlooked, stepped out from the paper. Trail and into the heart of the mystery. Owen Barrage had lived quietly on the edges of the map, a man who passed through small towns leaving only faint traces of his presence. But one line in his record made Detective Warren Kulich sit up. In 2011, Barrage had been the subject of a restraining order filed by a woman named Natalie Crest. Also from honor. The documents were sparse, just a 1-year order for a domestic dispute requiring Barrage to stay 500 feet from her home and workplace. It was never renewed. Kulich found Crest living in Manistee, now working as a dental hygienist. She agreed to meet him at a harborside coffee shop on a rainy April afternoon. Crest, in her early 40s, was wary but open. She said she had dated Barrage briefly in 2010. 3, maybe 4 months. At first, he was quiet and considerate, but over time his demeanor shifted into something darker. He would show up unannounced at her apartment, sometimes after midnight, claiming he wanted to make sure she was safe. He called her 20, 30 times a day, voicemails swinging between affection and accusation. When she tried to end things, he refused to accept it. He followed her to work, waited outside her building, and left notes on her windshield. The final straw came when he entered her apartment using a duplicate key she never knew he'd made. That was when she filed for the order. Kulich asked if he'd ever been violent. "No," Crest said softly. "Not with his hands, but the way he looked at me, like I belonged to him, made me afraid." She described his fixation as obsessive, a belief that certain people were bound together beyond ordinary relationships. He talked about loyalty, permanence, and how most people were temporary. He said if he ever truly cared about someone, she recalled, he'd never let them disappear from his life. The words sent a cold current through Kulich. When he asked if she knew where Barrage was now, Crest shook her head. She hadn't seen or heard from him since the order expired in 2012. "I was just glad he was gone." Outside, rain pelted the windshield as Kulich sat in his car making calls. To the Michigan State Police for a full background check, to the Social Security Administration for employment traces, and to the Postal Service for any forwarding addresses. Over the next 48 hours, a picture formed of a man methodically erasing himself, After leaving Honor in 2011, Barrage worked briefly at a marina in Leland, then a lumber mill in Buckley. Both employers described him the same way: competent, strange, withdrawn. In 2013, his name appeared on a lease at a trailer park in Kalkaska, but he was evicted 6 months later for disturbing other tenants. The complaints were vague: noises at odd hours, items vanishing from porches, a general unease. After that, he vanished from paper. No tax filings, no addresses, no trace. But Coolidge knew too well that people who disappeared from records didn't necessarily disappear from the land. They learned to live unseen, especially in the rural Midwest where cash work and quiet habits could stretch for years without notice. So he contacted the Department of Natural Resources again and requested a list of every hunting and fishing license issued in northern Michigan over the past 5 years. The database produced more than 12,000 entries, but after filtering by age, gender, and county, one name surfaced. Twice. Owen Barrage, age 44. He'd purchased a small game license in October 2018, listing his mailing address as General Delivery, Interlaken, the same post office where Travis Lorne once kept a box. Coolidge drove there and met the postmaster, Ed Kloss, a man with 23 years behind the counter. Kloss remembered Barrage immediately, and not fondly. He'd come in every few weeks, never said much, Kloss recalled. Polite, but something about him gave me the creeps. He added that Barrage had stopped showing up around March 2019, and a few pieces of unclaimed mail were still sitting in back. Kloss retrieved 2 envelopes, both from state agencies. One was a hunting license renewal notice. The other was a past due payment for a DNR campground permit issued near Interlaken State Park. Coolidge called the park office. The ranger on duty confirmed that the permit corresponded to Lot 1420, a primitive campsite on the park's western edge, connected by overgrown trails to the same stretch of state forest where Adrienne's remains had been discovered. The ranger said the site had been vacant for months but offered to send someone out. Coolidge declined. "I'll go myself," he said. By noon, he was there. Lot 14 was a small clearing surrounded by dense jack pine and scrub oak, reached by a rutted dirt road barely fit for a truck. No vehicle, no tent, no fresh tracks. But as Coolidge walked the perimeter, the landscape began to whisper clues. A fire ring built from hand-stacked stones, its ashes gray and compact, but recent. A scrap of blue tarp tangled in low branches, the same synthetic shade found on Adrienne Winl's messenger bag. And for the first time in years, the detective felt that the forest itself might finally be ready to give up its secrets. Near the edge of the clearing, something caught Detective Warren Coolidge's eye, a small cairn of stones arranged too neatly to be natural. He crouched beside it, the forest quiet except for the hiss of wind through the jack pines, and carefully began dismantling the pile. Beneath the last rock lay a shallow hollow in the earth, and in that hollow sat a mason jar sealed with a rusted metal lid. Holding his breath, Coolidge lifted it into the light. Inside were several small objects: a button embossed with a cardinal, a scrap of gray wool fabric, and a folded sheet of paper the color of old bone. His hands trembled as he unscrewed the lid. The paper was a torn page from a sketchbook, the edges frayed, the graphite lines still sharp. A winterberry branch, drawn with delicate precision, signed in small script. A. Winl. Coolidge rose slowly, the jar still in his grasp, scanning the clearing with new understanding. This wasn't just a campsite, it was a shrine. He called for backup and a full forensic team. Within 2 hours, the area was roped off and combed like a crime scene. One by one, they uncovered more hidden caches. Another mason jar held a cracked wristwatch. A third contained a lock of hair tied neatly with string. And beneath a rotted log at the far end of the site, they found a leather-bound journal wrapped in plastic to keep it dry. It belonged to Owen Barrage. The journal spanned 10 years, from 2009 to 2019, written in a tight, obsessive scrawl. Most entries were mundane, notes on weather, animal tracks, trail conditions, but scattered among them were fragments that chilled Coolidge to the bone. Passages about watching people, learning their patterns, and the purity of seeing without being seen. One entry, dated November 2009, read, "She doesn't know I'm here. That's the point. To see without being seen is the purest form of understanding." Another, written weeks later, was more explicit. "The ranger lent me his knife. He doesn't know. I'll never give it back. I don't need it for rope." The margins were filled with crude sketches, cabins, tree lines, silhouettes of lone figures seen from afar. Near the journal's end, a final entry dated early 2019 sent a shiver through the entire team. They found the bag. It was only a matter of time. I thought the river would keep her secret, but rivers talk. I hear them now, whispering her name. Every page was photographed, every object catalogued, and all evidence transferred to the state lab. Within a week, the results came back. The lock of hair matched Adrienne Winl's DNA. The fabric matched her gray wool coat. And on the cardinal emblem button, analysts recovered a partial fingerprint, astonishingly preserved after 10 years of exposure. It matched Owen Barrage, taken from his 2011 restraining order file. The puzzle that had haunted Benzie County for a decade had finally begun to take shape. Armed with physical evidence tying Barrage to Adrienne's belongings, detailed writings of stalking behavior, and corroboration from a past victim, the prosecutor authorized an arrest warrant. Coolidge mobilized the DNR, state police, and U.S. Forest Service in a coordinated search of the vast Michigan wilderness. For 2 weeks, they scoured the backcountry, remote ravines, river bends, and abandoned ranger trails, hunting for a man who had mastered how to vanish. Then, on May 3rd, a fire tower operator near the Boardman River reported seeing smoke curling from a ravine not listed on any official map. A tactical team hiked in and discovered a makeshift lean-to built from salvaged lumber and tarps. Inside were canned food, a propane stove, a sleeping bag, and, sitting calmly on a stump outside as if expecting company, Owen Barrage. He didn't run. He didn't resist. As officers approached, he rose slowly, lifted his hands, and said nothing. His face was gaunt, his hair long and matted, his clothes stained and torn, but his eyes were unnervingly clear. When one officer asked why he hadn't fled, Barrage simply replied, "Because running only delays the inevitable. I learned that from her. She ran, and it didn't matter." When pressed to explain, he gave a faint, almost sorrowful smile. "She tried to leave that night," he said quietly. "I saw her through the window, packing, moving fast. She was scared. I could feel it from outside. I knocked to tell her she didn't need to be afraid of me. But when she opened the door, she looked at me like I was a monster. And I realized she was right." His confession came in fragments over 3 long days of recorded interviews at the Michigan State Police Post in Traverse City. Coolidge sat across from him, a digital recorder running, while a prosecutor and a court-appointed psychologist observed through one-way glass. Barrage spoke without emotion, his voice calm, almost detached, as if recounting someone else's life. And as he began to describe the night of November 19th, 2009, the night Adrienne Winl disappeared into the Michigan snow, the room seemed to grow colder with every word. Through the one-way glass, the room fell silent as Owen Barrage described the night that had haunted Michigan for over a decade. His voice was calm, eerily so, as he spoke of curiosity that had turned into obsession. He said he'd first noticed the cabin's light flickering through the trees, and drawn by the rare glow of human presence in those woods, crept closer. Inside, he saw Adrienne moving around the small kitchen, her silhouette framed in the amber light of kerosene lamps. He claimed it wasn't lust or anger that pulled him there, but something he couldn't name. An attraction to her solitude, the way she seemed self-contained, whole. He watched for nearly an hour before slipping back into the darkness. But the next night, he returned. This time, he moved closer, circling the cabin like a ghost, memorizing the shape of the rooms through the windows, the rhythm of her movements. He saw her step out onto the porch to smoke and was surprised. She hadn't seemed like someone who smoked. Hidden in the tree line, he barely breathed. When she went back inside and locked the door, he stayed in the cold, motionless, listening to the silence. He said it felt peaceful, almost sacred, until he heard sudden movement from within. Drawers opening, clothes rustling, the scrape of a zipper. Peering through the window, he saw Adrienne hurriedly packing. Her hands shook. Her face was pale. Maybe she had seen him, or maybe she had only felt him. Felt the eyes that had been watching her for days. Either way, she was leaving. And that, he said, was when the panic took over. He knocked. Not to harm her, he insisted, but to talk, to explain she didn't need to be afraid. She opened the door just an inch, the chain still latched. Their eyes met, and in that moment, he saw something that would stay with him forever. Not confusion, not anger, but pure, unfiltered terror. She tried to shut the door, but he pushed. The chain snapped. He claimed he didn't remember choosing to do it. His body just moved. Adrienne stumbled backward, tripping over her suitcase. He stepped inside, saying he wasn't going to hurt her, but his words only made her more frantic. She grabbed a small kitchen knife, her hand trembling. He said he reached to take it, to calm her, but she resisted. The blade sliced his palm, and something inside him broke. In a flash of rage and fear, he struck her hard across the temple. She fell, hitting the edge of the table before collapsing. He said he stood over her for a long time, watching her breathe, watching blood seep from the wound above her brow. He knew, even then, that the line between accident and intention had vanished. She was alive, but if she woke, she would identify him. And in that twisted calculus of fear, shame, and desperation, he decided she couldn't wake up. He wrapped her in her coat and carried her into the night. The forest was black and silent, but Barrage knew the trails by heart. He moved fast through the snow, her body heavy in his arms, until he reached the riverbank where the current ran too strong to freeze. He laid her on the snow, pulled the ranger's knife from his pocket, the same timber ridge blade he'd borrowed weeks earlier, and stared at it. He said he didn't want to use it, but he couldn't leave her alive. If she survived the cold, he told himself, she would destroy what was left of his life. Still, when he pressed the blade to her throat, his hand wouldn't move. Adrienne stirred, opened her eyes for the last time, and looked at him. Not with fear, but something quieter. Acceptance, maybe, or sorrow. Then her breathing slowed, stopped. She died before I could decide, he whispered. The cold did what I couldn't. He said relief and horror came together in that instant. Relief that it was over, horror that it ever began. He covered her with branches and snow near the river, her body shallowly buried beneath the frozen earth. He took her messenger bag but couldn't bring himself to destroy it. It was proof she existed, he said softly. Proof that I hadn't imagined her. Over the years, he returned to the site again and again, adding trinkets, moving objects, turning a grave into something between memorial and obsession. When Detective Kulish asked why he had joined the original search in 2009, Barrage answered without hesitation. Because I had to, he said. I needed to know what they were finding. It was penance, I guess, pretending to care about bringing her home when I was the reason she was gone. And as his final words trailed off, the tape kept running, capturing the sound of his breathing. A slow, hollow rhythm echoing through the sterile room, the sound of a man who had spent 10 years lost in the woods of his own guilt. When Ranger Carl Hustis had asked to borrow a knife during the original search, Owen Barrage realized he still had the ranger's blade tucked inside his coat pocket. The same timber ridge knife he'd almost used that night by the river. It was still smeared with his own blood from the cut Adrienne had given him, so he told Hustis he'd misplaced it. The ranger didn't press. Months later, Barrage buried the knife near the spot where he had left Adrienne, calling it a gesture of closure, though even he admitted he didn't understand why. Forensics confirmed every word. The dried blood on the recovered knife matched both Adrienne Winl and Owen Barrage, consistent with his account of the struggle inside the cabin. Microscopic fibers on Adrienne's messenger bag matched, clothing Barrage had worn, verified, through photos taken during the 2009 search efforts, and the placement of her remains matched his detailed description of the burial site, later disturbed by floods that had carried her belongings downstream. On June 14, 2019, Owen Barrage was formally charged with second-degree murder, felony murder during a home invasion, and concealment of a death. He pleaded guilty to all charges, sparing the Winl family the pain of a trial. The plea hearing was brief. When the judge asked if he understood the consequences, Barrage said yes. When asked if he'd been coerced, he said no. Then came the final question, whether he had anything to say to Adrienne's family. Seated quietly in the front row, Claire Winl sat between her parents, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Barrage turned toward them. I can't ask for forgiveness, he said softly, because I don't deserve it. I think about her every day, and I will for the rest of my life. I'm sorry, doesn't cover it, but I don't have better words. Claire rose slowly. For a long moment, she just looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then she said, her voice clear and unwavering, You took my sister from us, but you don't get to keep her memory. That belongs to us. The judge sentenced Owen Barrage to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Detective Warren Coolidge attended the sentencing, but slipped out before the press conference. He drove north, past the Honor General store and the gas station where Adrienne had last smiled at the camera, past the narrow turnoff to the cabin she'd rented for her 5 days of silence. Eventually, he reached the clearing by the river, now marked with a wooden cross placed by Claire and her parents. Someone, perhaps Claire herself, had planted wildflowers around its base, their colors defying the gray November light. Coolidge stood there listening to the river's slow murmur, thinking about all the ways a life could vanish, and all the echoes it could leave behind. Claire had told him quietly after the hearing that she didn't feel closure, at least not the kind people talked about on television. What she felt, she said, was acknowledgement, a truth finally spoken aloud. Her sister's story had an ending now, and even though that ending hurt, it was better than silence. Back at his office, Coolidge filed his final report. He wrote that the case had been solved not through a single breakthrough, but through persistence. The steady accumulation of small truths, each one demanding that someone pay attention. Adrienne Winl, he noted, had been failed by proximity. The assumption that danger lived far away, rather than in the quiet spaces between neighbors. But she had also been honored by endurance, by her family's refusal to stop searching, by investigators who kept reopening old files, by the belief that no one's story should fade into the forgotten. That November, exactly 10 years after she disappeared, the town of Honor held a memorial service. More than 200 people filled the small community center. Claire spoke about her sister's love of plants, her gentle humor, her careful drawings that turned the smallest stem or leaf into art. A local choir sang. A retired teacher read a poem about winter and remembrance. As the evening ended, each guest lit a candle and placed it beneath a photograph of Adrienne, the image from the gas station security camera where she'd waved. Unguarded and alive, the candles burned deep into the night, tiny points of light against the encroaching dark, proof that even in the coldest season, warmth and memory can endure. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe, tap the notification bell, and share this video with someone who follows true crime cases. Every unsolved story still holds a family waiting for answers. Tell us in the comments, what cold case do you believe deserves more attention? She went to the woods seeking peace, and instead became part of them. For years, her family lived with questions colder than the winter that took her. But now, they finally have truth, however painful it may be. In a world where so many vanish without a trace, Adrienne's story reminds us that silence is never the end. It's only the beginning of someone still listening. If this story moved you, hit the like button, subscribe, and share it to help bring light to other cold cases still waiting to be heard. Because sometimes remembering is the only justice left.